So, I'm not an economist. I'm an architect by background, but I've been Dean of the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment for the last 9 years, and I'm a Professor of Architectural and Urban Computing. So you might say, well, what on earth am I doing chairing a session like this? I'm asking myself the same question. But I thought I'd start off with Henry's kind of piece where he questions the role of experts. And the role of experts have been questioned, particularly around sort of Brexit and Trump and various things going on over the last couple of years. And some of the experts that are questioned are very often economists. And so the lineup that we have at the panel this evening is really to probe that question. But I thought I'd start off with a reflection of my own around some reading I'm doing at the moment. I'm reading Vilfredo Pareto, who was an engineer. You're sitting in the engineering building here, by the way. He was an engineer who converted into being an economist, and then towards the end of his career, he wrote a treatise on sociology. And there's one particular reflection in that I want to highlight. He was writing in 108 years ago. He wrote his treatise in sociology, or published it. He published it in Italian. It didn't actually get published until 4 or 5 years after he wrote it, so I think 1916, right at the beginning of the First World War. And that was most unfortunate. It was published in Italian, and he then had the rather unfortunate experience of Benito Mussolini claiming him as his guru. And that, of course, gave him a terrible reputation amongst everybody else in the world. He didn't help himself in this, in that when he wrote his book, it was 1 million words long, rather poorly structured, and managed to criticize almost everybody. So he criticized democracy and liberals, he criticized Marxism and the communists, he criticized the fascists, he criticized everybody. And so he didn't actually get very many friendly critics, if you like, to back up his cause. But he said one thing that I think is really interesting. He said, why is it that, in spite of the fact that when we make decisions and we carry out actions, we do them largely on the basis of instinct and sentiment, of non-rational and non-rationalizable instincts and sentiments, that we invariably try to justify them according to rational argument. And he said this is the central question for sociology. Why is it, on the one hand, we do these non-rational things and that's how we behave, and then we seek to justify rationally? And he came to that because as an engineer, which is a highly rational persuasion, and converting to an economist, which is also highly rational in his book, Persuasion, understanding why it was that everybody went around the world and did what they did, largely for non-rational reasons, raised the question. And I think that's actually the fundamental question for me around the issue of expertise. When we talk about experts, what are they? Well, we expect them to be rational. But when we look at human behaviours and how decisions are taken, very often they're done on the basis of sentiment and belief and things that ultimately it's very hard to rationalise about. So that's where I wanted to start. Now what I'm going to do is to introduce all of our panellists to kick off, and then ask them each to do a very short 5-minute position statement, if you like, around this, and then we'll get a conversation going around the room, if that's okay. So let's start off. On my immediate left is Anne Pettifor. She's the Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, which is Prime, an Honorary Research Fellow in the Political Economy Research Centre at City University. her background is sovereign debt. Anne was one of the leaders of the Jubilee 2000 debt campaign, which wrote off 100 billion, that's a very small number, of debt owed by the 42 poorest countries. That's no small claim to impact there, I think. And Anne's one of the few to correctly predict the credit crunch in 2007 in the new Economics Forum's Real World Economic Outlook. And her book, The Coming of First World Debt Crisis, in 2006. Her latest publication is The Production of Money, How to Break the Power of the Bank, and is published in Verso. She was recently awarded the prestigious Hannah Arendt Prize in 2018 for political thinking. John Kay is one of Britain's leading economists, and his work is centred on relationships between economics, finance and business. His career spanned academic work, both London Business School, University of Oxford and the LSE, and in think tanks, company directorships, consultancies, and what he's doing mostly now is writing of several books. 2015, Other People's Money, top of the FT bestseller list, I believe. So I'm sure you'll get various other points to come from. Next, Josh Ryan Collins. Josh is head of research at UCL's new Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. This is a new institute actually in my faculty inside the Bartlett. A new research and policy centre focused on how public sector can shape and create markets to deliver public value. He was previously a senior economist for the New Economics Foundation, and that's one of the UK's leading think tanks, where he worked for 10 years. And his research focuses on the economics of innovation, finance, monetary policy, land and climate change. There's a whole range of things that are coming from the IIPP over the next few years, including a new Master of Public Administration, where we're setting up a whole set of programmes around this new push on how government and public sector needs to lead on innovation. And finally, at far end, last but not least, Angus Armstrong, who is the Director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and he was formerly a Managing Director at Deutsche Bank, Head of Macroeconomic Analysis at Majesty's Treasury. His PhD is in Economics, an Honorary Professor at Stirling and a Visiting Professor at Imperial. And with that, I'm actually going to ask Angus if he would care to kick off with the first go at the sort of position statement.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before I start, I should also just say I'm Chief Economic Advisor to the Lloyds Bank Group as well, just so for full disclosure. Many times this debate is framed around the Queen's famous question of why no one saw the crisis coming. I think that the answer to that question is equally interesting. There was a collection of about 35 economists and Treasury officials at the British Academy a few months after the Queen asked this question, from sit down and say, well, why was it nobody saw it coming? And the conclusion that they came to, I think, is very interesting. To quote Tim Besley, who wrote the letter back to the Queen to explain this failure, he said it was principally a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people. Now, you forget the bright people, whatever. But the interesting thing is, economists are not normally thought of in terms of collective imagination or imagination at all. So what was he talking about? And I think one of the really big events that happened in economics was in the very early 1970s, there was a change in the direction of economics where so-called real business cycle models were created. And the most important aspect of this was that uncertainty, the thing that is endemic in life, that we all face every time we cross the road or try to go home or cook the dinner, we all face uncertainty. Some things trivial, some things huge like Brexit. That has been reduced into something that is calculable, and once it's calculable, we can make all sorts of wonderful engineering models. And hence, a large part of the direction of core macroeconomic models over the last 40 years. Now, before I go into sort of a little bit further on those models, I just want to say a little bit about the crisis, because a lot of people say this is 10 years to the month, the crisis really got going in full strength. And I'm always very cautious to talk about this because there's been no civil servant's account, or nobody apart from a central bank governor or a chancellor has really given an account of what happened in the UK, which is quite remarkable when you think that our public debt sort of increased by about the amount in the Second World War, and we haven't had a proper accounting for what really happened. I was fortunate enough to be in the room with the ministers on the day, well, fortunate enough, let me be careful there. I was in the room when the ministers, when RBS's share price fell 40% in the morning. And RBS was at the time the first or second biggest bank in the world. And you can imagine the terror on the face of really leading solicitors from the city and bankers. It was terror. At which point the government minister did what I thought was a brilliant job. They turned around and said, could you all pull yourselves together? So a bit of a sort of schoolmastery statement. Said, we are the government. We actually make the rules up and we can manage this risk. So we had this unquantifiable amount of risk and uncertainty involved, but it's important to realise that it's precisely then that it's the government's role to say, and we're going to take this on and manage it. And that for me was really the dawn that this is the first time that people have really grasped that this is the fundamental role of the government at this stage. And in fact, the 14-point plan that went to the Prime Minister afterwards, which had at its heart something called the Asset Protection Scheme, which was I think a £240 billion insurance. What we did there was say, nobody knows how bad these banks are at the moment, but you know what? This is the time the government takes this risks, and then we solve it. The key point of this is, first, these models were rooted in mainstream economic models, but they were mainstream economic models which completely understood the role of uncertainty and asymmetric information. So there were mainstream economists who wrote these articles, but they all took on board uncertainty. Now, let me finish off by going back to Robert Lucas and the real business cycle models, what they do. They unfortunately really do the opposite by making everything calculable. And they tie down the long-term equilibrium. And so the only real question is, what's getting in the way of getting back to that point? That's the only problem. Just get rid of barriers. Anything's a barrier, get rid of it. Make markets work more like they should in a textbook. The big questions of today, financial stability. Well, financial stability is treated as an exogenous shock. It's outside the system. Goodness knows why it happens, but that's not our question. Productivity bustle. Productivity is outside the system as well. That's not our question. Even things like climate change, they happen to us, not within the system. And that, I think, is leading to a lot of this doubt about experts, because the big, really pressing questions of our day, of which you can include things like Brexit, apart from really very limited answers, we've denuded ourselves from the tools of being able to address those really very important questions of today. So I think there is a long way for modern macroeconomics to change in order to go backwards, fundamentally to take on board real uncertainty.
Thank you very much. Josh.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation, Henry, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'd just like to, I suppose, firstly, briefly reflect on progress or lack of in the last 10 years in sort of economics. And then just, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the Institute for Innovation Public Purpose, because I think, in a sense, that helps provide a sort of alternative direction that I think economics and sort of more broadly economic policy needs to focus on. I think there has been some progress in the economics field since the crisis, but it's been limited. I think you can look at institutions like the Institute for New Economic Thinking, who have funded young economists or heterodox economists outside the mainstream and brought their work to prominence. There's some evidence of some of the sort of top journals opening up to slightly different approaches, for example, incorporating finance and money and credit in their models. I think Angus's program is an excellent addition in the UK. clearly the ESRC has woken up to some of the challenges he was just talking about, and that's to be welcomed, although it still took quite a long time. But I think fundamentally we still, from an academic professional sense, we're still rather trapped in a system where essentially the top journals and most of the courses, the economics courses, the way they're taught, are still fairly homogenous in terms of, and when I mean homogenous, the teaching is focused on one particular approach, neoclassical and variants around it, rather than a more pluralist approach. And there's been some interesting arguments between mainstream economists and less mainstream about whether this is sustainable, and maybe we can come on to discuss that in more depth. But fundamentally, I think there's still a problem there. And we've also seen some more alternative schools of economics, such as Kingston, for example, collapsing due to lack of funds, or not collapsing, but kind of losing a lot of very good staff due to reforms around, for example, student numbers, and I think that's been a problem. So I think more progress needs to be made. I think more from an economic policy perspective, what we're trying to do at IIPP really is to challenge a few of the sort of shibboleths of mainstream economic thinking quite fundamentally, and see what that means for policy. So one of those shibboleths essentially is that markets or market exchange determines value. Thus, if there's a buyer of a good, the price on a free open market, the price that good fetches is the best way of thinking about value, subjective value. We would challenge that, because we would actually argue, and what we're trying to do at the Institute is to say actually markets are outcomes of the interaction between different sectors, between the public sector, between the private sector, between civil society to some extent. All markets, if you look through history, are created and shaped by different influences, and they can create value to a greater or lesser extent in terms of how they're actually designed, and that's one of the reasons IIPP is in the School of Built Environment, and because of the focus on design. And then the question becomes not so much who are the experts, but how do we involve the right people in designing this market to create public purpose, to create the outcomes that we want to see. I'll just give you one example to try and make this a bit clearer. Let's think about the market for land. The market for land, land is inherently scarce, desirable land is inherently scarce and finite, unlike many other commodities. So the solution to rising house prices is not simply to build more houses or to increase the supply of houses, it's to also think about the demand for property given that inherently finite supply, and to think about, for example, tax policy, the fact that your primary residence is not taxed for capital gains, unlike nearly all other financial assets. Does that create a demand for housing as a financial asset rather than just a place to live? So if you were designing a market for land, you'd probably want a tax expert in the room. You might want somebody who's an expert on mortgage lending, because mortgage credit can pump up house prices. You might want an urban planner in the room. You might want somebody who has an alternative to private ownership, so somebody who's familiar with cooperative housing models or social housing models. You might want one or two economists, but you certainly wouldn't want the whole of the housing market just to be designed by economists. Unfortunately, we still, in many markets, believe that that there are quite simple explanations. So that's what I wanted to throw out, really. And then when you're designing broader goals, what we call missions at IIPP, I think it's important that you do also involve people, civil society, social movements in the defining of those missions. So many of the great innovations that we have, take the pill for example, were not the result of top-down state activity, but they're a result of people who are most affected by the problem taking action, building momentum. If you look at the Energiewende in Germany, the movement to green the economy, again, that's an example of government and civil society coming together. So
thank you very much, Josh. John?
Angus has raised the issue of how we deal with uncertainty in economics. And that's fundamental both to economics and to the problems we're debating tonight. I want to take you into a little bit of history about this. If you go back to the 1920s, there was a debate in economics in which there were two sides. One, oddly, it was a debate between Cambridge and Chicago, but it wasn't Cambridge on one side and Chicago on the other. There was someone from Cambridge and someone from Chicago on each side. And so the two leading protagonists were actually arguing with each other from the same institutions. Keynes was at Cambridge and was deeply sceptical about the way in which statistics was evolving and in the way in which people were claiming to be able to apply probabilities to a whole range of phenomena. His colleague at Cambridge, Frank Ramsey, a brilliant mathematician, economist, philosopher, whom we don't know much about because he actually died at the age of 26, he was on the other side of this, and he believed that the scope of probabilistic reasoning could be extended almost indefinitely. On the other side, in Chicago, there was a group of people led by Frank Knight, who, like Keynes, emphasized the importance of radical uncertainty, the limitations of probabilistic reasoning, and believed that it was these things that actually provided the opportunities for entrepreneurs to innovate and make profits. And that work, the other kind of thinking, the Ramsey type of thinking, you could use probabilities for everything, was developed at Chicago by an economist, statistician called Savage, and then immediately after the Second World War, Savage collaborated with Milton Friedman, and actually Keynes lost that debate, Keynes and Knight lost that debate, and Savage, Ramsey, Friedman won it. A few years later, writing what was a defining text of the Chicago School in the United States, when Friedman would write, Frank Knight, Toyen of Chicago at the time, made a distinction between risk, which you can express probabilistically, and uncertainty, which you can't. I do not accept that distinction, he said. We can treat people as if they applied probabilities to every conceivable event. And that assumption has been the basis of largely the macroeconomic models which we're describing ever since. But I don't think it's a correct assumption. When the crisis broke in 2007, David Viniar, who was at the time the chief financial officer of Goldman Sachs, said we've experienced 25 standard deviation events several days in a row. Now, those of you who know anything about probability will know that that could not have happened. What he meant, of course, was not that he experienced these highly improbable events day after day, but that the events were not incorporated within the Goldman Sachs model, and that was the essence of the problem. So we can't apply probabilities to every conceivable event. We can't have a probability of inventing a wheel, because if you could imagine a probability of inventing a wheel, you've already invented it. The scope of probabilistic reasoning is much less than people actually believe. So what do we do instead? How do we cope with narrative, with radical uncertainty? The kind of uncertainty that we can't express in probabilistic terms. What we do is we tell stories. In fact, that's actually how we communicate with each other. And since we can't attach probabilities to the future, the way we think about the future is not in probabilistic terms, it's in narrative terms. That's actually the way we think. And that takes us to a rather different concept. of rationality from the one that emerges from the kind of axioms which were the basis for dealing with uncertainty probabilistically and form the basis for the macroeconomic policies and models which we've been describing. It's a different concept of rationality, and it's a concept of rationality that relates not, as the economic concept typically does, to certain axioms about behaviour. It's not even the kind of rationality that Alan was describing as the rationality of the engineering model, which takes the complexity of the world and defines a rather small world, which you can actually express mathematically, and when you can start talking probabilistically. We live in large worlds, and the way we cope with large worlds is we tell stories to each other. Now, what I think we are beginning to learn is the ways in which, for example, financial crises relate to this narrative account. If one asks what happened in the run-up to the crisis of 2007, 2008, the essence was that people persuaded themselves very widely of a false narrative. And that false narrative was that the models, the probabilistically based models which had been used to manage risk in the 5-7 years that preceded it, enabled risk to be managed more effectively, spread, diversified, and left institutions more robust to what had happened. Actually, essentially, the opposite was the case. What was happening was that risks were being traded in ways which meant they landed up with people who understood less about them than the people who were selling the risks to them in the first place. It was a transfer, in effect, from the fairly blind to the more or less entirely blind. And when a degree of reality broke in 2007, 2008, the narrative changed abruptly, and people asked, so what the hell have we been doing? And they were left at sea with a set of tools which didn't enable them to navigate through the mess that had been created. So these are the things we need to start thinking about if we're to frame a macroeconomics which is better at reasoning these things. I think it's intriguing that probably the best and classic description of the radical uncertainty I've described goes back to Keynes when he wrote in 1937, and for a long time I thought he wrote it earlier than 1937, but it was explaining to an American audience what was in the general theory. And he said about many things, about the price of copper in 20 years' time, or what will be the place of private property in 1970, about these things we simply do not know. There is no basis, scientific basis, for attaching probabilistic reasoning at all. And that, I believe, is correct and ought to govern our thinking. It doesn't mean we can't talk about these questions. We should and must talk about these questions, but talk about them in this narrative manner. Now let me end by picking up 2 points I think that have been made earlier. One is about evolution and the other is about communication. One thing I've learned in thinking through these issues is that many things are currently being done outside economics that are highly relevant to our understanding of economics. I think the two most interesting books in this sense I've read in the last 2 or 3 years have been Joe Henry's book, The Secret of Our Success, and what Henry argues is essentially for the importance of communicative rationality and the ways in which cultural evolution has enabled us to produce amazingly complex products. An Airbus 380 employs tens of thousands of people, most of whom don't know who they are. They work together, partly cooperatively, partly competitively. We need to understand better the essentially evolutionary processes by which this extraordinary achievement comes about. Heinrich quotes the primatologist Michael Tomasello, who said you'll never see two chimpanzees carrying a log together. That's right. And the contrast between that and the ability to build an Airbus is absolutely extraordinary. And the second book is by Mercier and Sperber. It's called The Enigma of Reasoning, and it picks up exactly the point which Alan made in his introduction. There is a difference between the way we make decisions and judgments and the way in which we talk to other people about these decisions and judgments. Both of these are entirely valid, but once we understand better the evolutionary processes by which our exceptional collective intelligence has been developed, we will be able to have a much more fruitful discussion of the kind of issues which are on the agenda tonight.
Thanks very much, John. Before Anne starts, if everybody who's got a space on their row shovels up one, the people who are sitting on the stairs and standing at the back could get a seat.
Selected upstairs.
Thanks very much.
Those who can't shovel up, don't worry about it. Okay, thanks very much. Anne.
Right, well, thank you very much. I'm honoured to be here. I want to congratulate Henry and Teresa on what they're doing, promoting economic pluralism. It's really very exciting and terribly important, and I would urge you all to give support, both financial and other kinds of support. So it's really wonderful to be here. Well done, and great crowd. Thank you for all coming. I thought I would just talk about today, actually, because I was called to the BBC at lunchtime to comment on the latest numbers around wages. And the evolution of the debate today around wages tells us, I think, quite a deal, not about experts and about the problems that we face. And I want to talk about this very, very practical problem because it affects us all. So today, the ONS announced that wage inflation was at 2.9% over the year, but that in real terms, inflation was 0.5%, wages inflation by 0.5%. And for total pay, the number is lower. But the Financial Times had a headline, admittedly it's their fast FT headline, so it may have just been dashed off. Labour market gives workers greater bargaining power and creates inflationary pressure. So this is the debate that we've had for a very long time. The 1970s is often attributed, inflation of the 1970s is often attributed to workers and to the fact they demanded higher wages. It's not new, but I would like to argue that the debate around inflation is really quite ideological, and it is revealed today. So what we know is that very little has happened to pay since before the crisis. Real average total pay in July 2018 is £491. Real average total pay in July 2016 was higher, £493. And 10 years ago, in July 2008, real average total pay was £501. That's what I'm talking about. So what we've seen is that pay was higher before the crisis than it is today, and that it was higher in 2016 than it is today. So what we've had is economists telling us that higher pay would lead to inflationary pressures, and the declaration that these are inflationary pressures leads to other policy consequences, and I'll come on to that again. So back in 2014, the Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, told the TUC that wages would start rising in real terms in 2014. Around the middle, is what he said in 2014, around the middle of next year, 2015, and that wages would accelerate afterwards. They did rise in the first half of 2015, but they decelerated afterwards. They didn't accelerate, as he'd argued. So why are the experts repeatedly wrong-footed by these events? And the trouble is that by being wrong-footed on something as important as inflation, experts go on to make other policy errors. So the trouble is that the Bank of England, they cling doggedly to a flawed theory, which is that when unemployment is low, wages rise and inflation rises. But that hasn't been the case for the last 10 years, and yet they still doggedly stick to that. And what it has driven is Bank of England policy making. So the bank appears committed to putting up has already committed to putting up interest rates, and presumably after today will put up interest rates again at its next meeting on Thursday. And that, affects the whole of the economy. But is putting up interest rates at this point in the evolution of the post-crisis economy right? I would argue no, it isn't. That in fact, there are different problems. The problem is not wages. The problem is not inflation. The problem is very weak demand. The problem is that the economy is still very weak, that wages are low not because unemployment is low, but because investment is low, and because the private sector, which is heavily indebted, is reluctant, rightly, in my view, to invest, because conditions are not ideal for that. If I were an entrepreneur, I would be very nervous about borrowing money from the banks, because I'm not borrowing at 0.25 or 0.5 or 0.1%, as the banks borrow from the central bank. I'm borrowing at a much higher rate. And I have to make profits and returns in excess of that rate of interest in order to be able to repay my debt as an entrepreneur. And so I'm really quite nervous about doing that. In my view, entrepreneurs on the private sector are right to believe that the conditions are not good for taking risks and for investing at this point. And of course, it's all made much worse by Brexit. But at the same time, the Bank of England is raising rates, and that, of course, has an impact on the whole spectrum of rates across the lending process, short or long-term, safe and risky loans, and in real terms. So we have a situation now where policy making is still, in my view, going in the wrong direction because of a flawed analysis by experts. The Bank of England was convinced back in 2014 that wages were going to rise and that they were going to accelerate. They didn't. And the Bank of England doesn't seem to understand why they've not accelerated. And that, in my view, is because they're hanging on to what is a flawed and out-of-date theory, and they're ignoring what's really going on in the real economy. The weakness of demand, the weakness of economic activity, the high levels of debt, and the degree of uncertainty and volatility out there. And in those circumstances, we're not ready for higher rates. And we've seen what higher rates in the United States is doing to low-income countries, to countries like Argentina and Turkey, and we're seeing how actually the stronger dollar and higher rates is creating the kind of volatility that led to the crisis in low-income countries back in the 90s, that began on the periphery of the global economy but gradually moved towards the core. So, for me, the very big worry, and I speak here as someone who is a practitioner and not an academic, the big worry is that if experts get those things badly wrong, we all pay the price for it. And it's about time that our experts began to dig out and understand why it is that wages are still so low, why it is that inflationary pressures are still so low, and why it is that we shouldn't, at this point, be raising interest rates when we know that we haven't resolved the huge overhang of private debt, private and public debt, that still exists, and that was created both before the crisis and has been created since the crisis. So for me, experts are a worry. They're a worry for all of us, because when they get things wrong, the impact on our livelihoods, on our lives, on our work, on our home lives, on our ability to afford a home or to go to university is really quite considerable. And I don't have the confidence that they've got it right yet.
Thank you very much, Anne. Okay, now before I open this up to the floor, so please do prepare your questions. I thought I'd kick off and take Chairman's initiative here. We've heard a failure of inspiration, a failure of vision. We've heard John saying that there's a distinction between the probabilistic view of the world and a narrative view of the world. I think those two things tie in very interestingly. And I'm going to ask a question. In my profession, the built environment, we have both engineers and we have architects. And these have intentions and methods of working that are somewhat orthogonal to each other. Engineers take the laws of physics and they predict what will happen if you build something specific. You know, will the bridge wobble, or will it bend and collapse? And they can do that because they have previous experience and previous trials. But telling you that you want a bridge in the first place, that's the role of somebody whose job it is to envision something that's never been there before. And that's what the role of the architect is. So we have a division of labour in the built environment between those who envision something, and they envision a future that has never been constructed before, and those whose job it is to engineer that on the basis of all the past history that we have to try to make sure that it works as you would hope and expect. In our economic life, do we have the equivalent of the architect? Do we have the visionary who says this is where we should go? It seems to me that the failure of Brexit, by the way, whichever side of the camp you're on, is there's a lack of vision and a lack of stated vision about what it is. All of those who were Remainers know exactly what they were voting for. They were voting for what's already there. Those who are Leavers, I have no idea what they're voting for. And 2 years on, and they seem not able to write the policy paper to contest checkers. So, anyway, that's not better than Brexit. Where do we go on that? Who would like to pick up?
Well, I mean, I can have a go at answering that, because I mean that's exactly what we're trying to do at the Institute, the IIPP, and our argument is focused initially anyway on the public sector, because our view is that the public sector, the state, has rather forgotten its role in shaping vision for the future. Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. You know, what does public purpose mean? What does public value, as I said, public value outside market value actually mean? And how can we achieve that? And obviously, you know, we have achieved great things as a human species. We've put a man on the moon. We have created electric vehicles and various other incredible inventions. But to do those, it wasn't simply a case of letting the market do its thing. You know, it was a case of saying, this is where we want to be in 10 years' time. This is what we want to achieve. Are you with us? You know, are you going to come in with us on that or not? So there's lots of debate. The classic accusation in mainstream economics is the danger of government taking action is that it will crowd out the private sector. It will crowd out the market. We would rather say that you need to be crowding in the market and crowding in the private sector to achieve the mission that you're aiming for, whether it's decarbonising the economy, whether it's a plastic-free ocean, whether it's using artificial intelligence to support people as they get older with everyday tasks. And that's what we've forgotten, and we need to get that dynamism, that boldness back.
If I can just add a couple of points to that. First of all, I think partly this is a product of, again, the way that we approach our economic models. So we assume in our consumers' economic models that we have stable, transitive preferences that are well behaved, you're not influenced easily, when in fact, you know, we have these occasional things called great leaders, and their job is to influence us, but they can't exist because we say we've got our own stable preferences. So a lot of the potential narratives or the leadership to try and guide us to those things are almost ruled out in these models by our primitive assumptions. The second thing I would say is we've institutionalized the economic approach to, say, economic architecture. We have this thing called the Green Book, which is it's cost-benefit analysis for all government projects. and there's nothing about social behaviour in it, non-pecuniary benefits. Does this influence people's behaviour? You have a mixed community, mixed housing community. How does that shape your society? All of those things are out of it. It's just a pretty bland, frankly, cost-benefit analysis, which of course does shape how we approach government decisions to the environment. So there's a lot that can be done for changing these sort of institutional structures, which would hopefully lead to broader decisions.
It's worse than bland, Alan. The Green Book goes with something called WebTag, which is the Department of Transport template for analysing transport projects in the UK. It's a little bit of a bête noire of mine, because if you look up WebTag, you will find, if you want to know what will be the average number of passengers in a car on Friday evenings in 2036, there's a number for that. If you want to know what the British growth rate will be in 2080, to 2 decimal places, there's a number for that. And these numbers go into the calculations which are made to assess major UK projects like HS2 or Heathrow Airport or the like. Now, it's not a matter of having too much of experts or enough of experts. It's using experts in wholly absurd ways. We do not know these numbers. They exist only because someone has created a very large spreadsheet and has tried to fill in all the cells of that spreadsheet. And that doesn't just happen in the British government, it happens in businesses. Consultants of large businesses are selling models of these kinds. And this is, I'm going to say it's a waste of time. It's worse than a waste of time. This pretense of knowledge is actually actively misleading. So what do we do instead? Well, I'm very suspicious of the word visions. I'm suspicious of the word visions because I've spent a lot of time with businesses and strategy weekends where people have visions. I remember one, and we were in an auditorium, and there was this guy who had been flown in from the United States to facilitate the occasion. And he went up and down, thought he was looking like a pimp trying to attract customers to an upstate nightclub, trying to attract attention. And he said, what kind of company do we want to be? Do we want to be Europe's leading firm in our industry or not? You thought about that for a moment. And he said, let's take a vote on it. By this time, you can imagine that quite a lot of people were looking down at their shoes in just embarrassment. But the vote went ahead, and you can guess which way it went. And then they decided to become Europe's leading firm in their industry. So they had to buy a German firm because they had a rather small market share in Germany. And so it went on. That's the world of visions. And I don't want to be anywhere near that. The world of real strategy is not, as it is for another group of people, about creating spreadsheets full of numbers, rather like these WebTag models, which is what a lot of companies did in the 1970s. They had books, planning books, full of lots of numbers. It's about actually having coherent narratives that are framed around, in the business case, the strengths of your business. In the policy case, about realistic objectives of what you're trying to achieve. And they're filled in with specific and detailed ideas about how you are going to be capable of getting there. That's strategy. And it's important for business, and it's important for public policy, and it's important for everything else. And it's framed around finding coherent narratives that describe where you are today and where you're going. And that's the task macroeconomists also need to take part in. And that's a sense in which we haven't had enough of experts, but we've certainly had enough of models that have claims to knowledge about the world that we cannot possibly have.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to narrative theory. Anne, do you want to
No, I
do
have
on this?
nothing to add.
Any questions from the floor? Oh, show of hands. Let's start over at the back and then come forward. Halfway.
Halfway here, I think.
Check your shirt. That's all.
David Merrill. Let's say we had 2008 all over again, which many people predict. Britain is recession, Britain is on the verge of depression. As economic experts yourselves, what is Britain's capacity to spend itself out of a recession or depression? What do you think the fiscal rule should be that guides our government in terms of its capacity to spend in such a situation?
I can answer that.
Do we start straight away? Or?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the easy question. This was something which we were actually grappling with back in 07, 08, of where are the limits to the amount that you could borrow to provide this sort of support. And the critical question here is the extent to which our public have confidence in the promise that the government makes, which is why things like narrative, what is a government debt contract or what is money? It's just a belief in the quality of this commitment. And so the question of, do I think that we're near some sort of limit in terms of debt to GDP ratio, that if that occurrence was to happen again, we couldn't have an expansive fiscal policy? I think we could have a expansive fiscal policy. We've been at 200% debt to GDP ratios in the last 200 years without having a problem selling the debt. We're at 100% or 92% today. So there's still a lot of capacity, but it's fair to ask the question, and it's important in this world of capital being far more mobile than it was in the past, to consider what is it that really keeps people invested in the British government, who is the people who back this. So I don't think we're near the limits if that were to become the reality, but I think it's an important question. I don't think it can be answered by just a simple number with a macroeconomic model. I think it's a much deeper question about society and its cohesiveness that lies behind those commitments.
Anne?
Do you want more than one answer to
Yes,
this?
so I've got two answers to this one.
Okay.
Then
I just
we'll
know
move
that
around.
you're a very strict chair, so
No,
right. I would say that there ought to be no fiscal rule, or if there is a fiscal rule, not the fiscal rule that we hear about. The fiscal rule should be that the government should intervene to restore prosperity, stability. That should be the fiscal rule. That is the role of government, is to protect society from the threat that a crisis would cause. And so I don't think we should have a rule, and I think that's been the problem, and if I may say so, it is still the problem, that, when the rule is that it should not be more than 90% of GDP, as has been argued by Kenneth Rogoff, that is a really deeply flawed approach. The rule should be government must intervene to restore stability and prosperity, and it's simple as that.
Thank you.
And like Angus, I don't believe that that our government, there may be other governments in the world that cannot raise the finance at an affordable rate, but this government can, mainly because we pay our taxes, mainly because there are 30 million taxpayers that back up the land agreement, and we have the institutions that hold the authority of the land agreement. And so, unlike many countries that lack those institutions, our ability to make promises to pay exceed that of most others.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting panel discussion. I'm a mathematician and profoundly skeptical of attempts to apply mathematics to describing and predicting human behavior on a vast scale like a nation state. So my question goes to the two people who've mentioned the design, and then the engineers and the physicists will work out the solution. Like, we need a bridge here, that's a visionary thing. So the engineers know how to construct the bridge, they understand the principles. Or they know how to get a man on the moon, the physicists use Newton's laws and things like that. Those are very simple problems
Yeah.
compared to the way humans interact on a social, economic, political way. I mean, it's so vastly different. It's more like trying to understand how an animal works, how it thinks, how it knows how to breed, how it knows how to hunt prey, all kinds of things. Wow, I mean, how do you think that, my question goes back
Go to me.
to you, yes, Mr. Penn, and also Mr. Josh Ryan Collins. Do you think that this is a problem that physicists and engineers can solve once it's posed correctly?
No, I don't think it's a problem just that can be easily solved by physicists and engineers. I mean, the problem you're talking about is sort of macroeconomic stability or full employment or kind of big macro problems. Is that the sort of problem you're talking about?
The interaction of Wall Street with the rest of the economy, the role of the president and his... I have come from a country where it's very unpredictable at the moment. But, okay, so you have experts like Larry Summers and Timothy Geithner, and you have Alan Greenspan, and you have these very intelligent people designing policy based on what? And so how do you approach this? I mean, I don't see physics and mathematics having much of a role here.
Yeah, no, I didn't say that to be fair.
No.
But what I would say is I would not support a parallel between economics and the hard sciences, physics, etc. I don't think that's appropriate. I think the type of knowledge is different. The type of expertise talking about is qualitatively different. I think economics should be viewed more as a social science along with other social sciences, and hence it should be subject to pluralistic theoretical and empirical approaches. Although, having said that, I do think there could be a lot more high quality applied empirical economic research that could inform policy decisions than there is at the moment. There's actually too much of a dependence on theory, I would argue. But given that, I think that the politics is very important, because if you're in a world of uncertainty, radical uncertainty, John was talking about, that means you don't know the perfect answer to the problem. You can't predict the future. Hence, it's extremely important that your decisions reflect the needs in society in a way that's fair and that's sustainable, and that's where the public purpose bit comes in. So rather than it being a perfect physics problem, it's an imperfect social problem, which requires experimentation and where you don't find the answer easily.
It's very, very hard to get that right.
I'm going to abuse my privilege and respond to you. I think the point here is that so long as people do behave statistically in large numbers, you can make those type of statistical probabilistic predictions. And there are certain places in which that happens. So how drivers drive on motorways are eminently open to understanding as statistical physics. And so we have those M25 variable speed limits that keep the traffic flowing more than if you didn't have them, perhaps. The point is that there's an awful lot of aspects of human society that are not amenable to that sort of statistical approach, as John was saying. And in those areas, I think you have to take a quite different approach. So I always say about architects, we get 100% correct in terms of our predictions, because we decide we're going to do that and then we do it. Yeah. Now, in fact, it's not quite fair, because there are architectural failures where we say we're going to do that and then we build it and it doesn't work. But the idea that you've got to be able to predict from previous history in order to aim for the future is actually something which you can give the lie to by deciding that what we're going to do is do something that's never been done before and then to make it happen. And this puts you into a different epistemological field than the rest of science. It may be that for human civilization on the scale you're talking about, that's what's required, is a different take on epistemology. So the whole series of people here. Gentleman in the white shirt, lady in the second row, gentleman in front of her. Can we take three at a go? And yes.
Okay, is this working?
It is.
Donald Field, a retired scientist. What do the panel think of the view that underlying these areas that the experts struggle with, whether it's in business or economics or managing uncertainty or politics, and underlying it within the banking system is a structural failure of controlling the money creation. Every time a bank makes a loan, they create new money, and they expect to be repaid with interest, which has to come from somewhere else. The result of this structure is that the money supply is ever increasing. And since the Bretton Woods was abandoned 50 years ago, this process of expansion of the money supply worldwide, it's not only in Britain, it's in America and Europe, has accelerated. And this is why over those years, debt levels have risen more or less inexorably. And currently, Angus said that we are not quite at the worst of it, but the aftermath of the Second World War was a rather special situation where America was pouring resources to restructure Europe. And the only other time we had a debt to GDP ratio that's worse than the current one was in 2007 before the crisis. So this is a pattern of the debt, both private and public, rising forever. It's unsustainable, and it's a structural issue underlying all these other areas of expertise. What do the panel think about that?
Thank you. Lady in the second row.
My question is partly for Professor King, partly for the panel. Professor King, you started off by talking about how the narrative, the wrong narrative had been bought by people. Others, such as England, talked about narrative closure, narrative distortion, and how the right things weren't talked about. But others, such as Mallory, have also talked about how it's not intellectual failures, but actually political constraints that prevented experts from providing expertise. Is the problem not that we need to create structures and we need to create academic pluralism built into the system so that we are able to stand up against this these political boundaries and these political ideas which come through, rather than one of just saying, excusing these people by saying, oh, they bought into the wrong theory.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in the front row.
Paul Hudson, retired from lecturing economics and econometrics. I wish I'd studied actually economic history rather than econometrics. I just want to make a comment, mainly in fact, on Angus Armstrong's point about nobody foresaw, in fact, the crisis coming. I don't know why this keeps on being repeated. I've even written to the BBC, they don't actually take any notice. Mind you, that's a dreadful source of misinformation and miseducation on economics. But in fact, way back in 2006, 2005, I'd been working in Germany and then came back. There were a number of seminars given at SOAS by young lecturers, PhD students from various parts of Europe, giving seminars. Most of them, I think, were inspired by a Minskian attitude, where in fact they did make the predictions. So I don't know why this keeps going around. I think partly it's to do, and John Kay actually touched on this, is that there are people in various silos, whether they're Marxians, post-Marxians, post-Keynesians, and the rest of it. They don't talk to each other, and that shows up in the journals. They just don't actually take on any other points of view, and I think this is one of the reasons why economics has got such a bad reputation. These rankings of various journals and the citation indexes, this is based on very dubious metrics. I think basically economists have got themselves to blame.
Thanks very much. Anne, start with you, because it's about money. The first question in the list is about the money supply.
Yeah, I mean, these are really big questions and deep questions. I'm inclined, I'm not happy with this talk of narrative and storytelling and all of what we've discussed tonight, because for me there are real structural issues in the economy which are well understood, but which haven't been looked at over a period of time. So I always like to compare the economics profession to the geologists, basically. And geologists spend a lot of time on beaches and on the surface, looking at pebbles and stones and other artifacts, and then with time discovered something called the tectonic plates. But before they discovered tectonic plates, they didn't understand, really didn't understand volcanic eruptions. So for me, economics has spent too much time in microeconomics, in understanding the behavior of individuals and firms and their interactions and adding them up and calculating and projecting their behavior and all of that stuff, which is really not about what's actually going on in the real, in the way in which the economy is structured. And the economy is structured, or it has, should I say, since 1971 been destructured very purposely. And we know that. We know that deregulation of finances happen. We know that there is such a thing as easy money, i.e. money that is created without proper regard to whether or not it can be repaid. And we know that interest rates have had their ceilings. Ceilings have been removed of interest rates, and interest rates are now treated as a price for something called a commodity, the money or the credit. And we know that interest rates are not the price of a commodity, that they do not behave like prices do. We know all this. This is all knowledge, and this is knowledge largely that we've got from Keynes, but we've ignored it. And so I have a problem with the discussion about economics as if it was this complex of interaction between individuals, when actually we've structured the economy and we've structured it in a certain way which benefits the 1% and makes the rest of us pay. That is not an accident. That hasn't happened because, of complex behavioural attitudes or anything. It's happened because we actually set up a structure, or we dismantled a structure.
Je suis d'accord.
And so I think that until we start thinking, and what I like about what Angus is doing is that this is a project which is looking at the macroeconomy, which is looking at aggregate behaviour in the economy and understanding this in a better way, it seems to me, than economists were doing in the past, when they were peering at and trying to add up all the various millions and billions of interactions that there are between individuals and firms. We know that we can look at aggregate behaviour, aggregate economic behaviour, and understand it and analyse it. We've done it in the past and we can do it again. But we refuse to do it because we don't want to look at these structural issues of, for example, how money is created, who decides, and what the price is of that money.
Thank you.
I think I better respond just because I was mentioned. I think I either must be misheard or misspoken, but it was the Queen who said, "Why did nobody see this coming?" So I was paraphrasing her,
Yes, sorry.
not me.
Yes, sorry.
That's quite all right. Your second point about the different schools of thought in economics that clearly not speak to each other. The Rebuilding Macroeconomics Network is managed by a psychologist, an anthropologist, a complexity theorist, and 2 economists. And its whole idea is actually to try and get these people to speak to each other. And it's quite fun because it's actually harder than you think. You might think they're all quite, sane people sitting around the table, they can speak to each other. But after about 15 minutes, once they've got their languages set, it's really meaningful engagement and dialogue that they might go and do some research together. It's quite a difficult thing. You've got to lock them up for quite a long time before they start lowering their sort of personal barriers and start listening to what either the physicist or the sociologist has to say. And the gentleman who asked about the banking and the international banking and so on, there are some, I completely agree with this, some deep, profound problems. And the one, if I was to sort of look at the crisis in hindsight and say, what do I think was the most distinctive feature of it? I think it was the international interconnectivity of all of these countries, some of which don't seem to have done a great deal wrong in terms of their domestic policy, but all of them got into trouble. That was what made it different. It wasn't just like a housing bubble, it was all of them got into trouble. And the points you raised about the gold standard, not that I think that that's necessarily the right thing to do, but it is interesting that our solution to this, that lots of countries needing access to somebody else's currency, is to create these swap agreements between central banks, which encourage people to do more of it, not less of it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an interesting answer if that was the problem. You borrowed with other people's money in particular. So some of these deep questions, I think you're quite right to raise them, and in my personal view, is that they really haven't been properly got to the bottom of.
I want to go back to the question of narratives and politics, because I think it's fundamental to understanding the sources of financial crisis. If we take the three major financial crises of the last 20 years, we're talking about the new economy bubble and the inflating and bursting 1999-2000. We're talking about the credit expansion through 2003, 2007, and the subsequent collapse of that. And we're talking about the European convergence up to 2007 and the ongoing simmering Eurozone crisis which has followed from that. Now, one thing you should notice about each of these is that the underlying causes, or the proximate causes of each of these, are in fact very different. Which is why when someone said, when we have the 2008 crisis again, we won't have the 2008 crisis again. We will have a different crisis. And it's very difficult to describe in advance what the shape of that crisis is going to be. But if you look at the dynamics of each of these crises, the common story is of some real underlying economic development. In the new economy bubble, and the internet was, as we now know, an important economic and significant economic innovation. It just wasn't going to transform economies in the next 18 months, which is what appeared to be supposed there. The European convergence was real. That was an effect of the creation of the Eurozone and the European single market. Again, it was exaggerated, but it was real. And equally, there were opportunities in these complex debt instruments to create both cheaper and better diversified risk management processes. But each of these stories was wildly exaggerated. And what happened in each case was that people who were quick to see these stories made money, that encouraged other people to buy into the same stories. And then in each one of these cases, you saw effectively contagious narratives in which people said things to each other and reinforced each other. And in the new economy bubble, which was both the most absurd and the most limited of these false narratives, you saw on the one hand the near kind of intimidation of people into going along with the narrative, both commercial and political. And then you discovered, and this, I must say, surprised me because it was the first time I'd seen it. When things collapsed in 2000, 2001, you discovered nobody had believed in it, or so they would tell you. That they all knew it wasn't real, or so they said. And there was something in that. But people are swept along by these contagious narratives, and if they're false or exaggerated, as they were in all these cases, then what happens is you get the reversion when reality breaks in. That's in the modern world, and indeed in the historic world, the essential mechanism of financial crisis. And of course, it hasn't gone away, but we don't make the same kind of mistake twice, or at least not in a single generation.
Can I show you a graph? This is, if you can see it here, there's a graph of GDP to debt ratio between 1810 and 1840. And you can see it's a peak at around about 1815 to 1820, it peaks at 250. Yeah.
Debt to GDP or GDP? Debt to GDP?
This is percent GDP to debt, I believe, is the way to say it. Is that the right way around? Anyway, whichever way up it is in the standard.
Napoleonic.
Yes, well, it's Battle of Waterloo, but it's also to do with the end of slavery. Yeah, we bought out the whole of that in order to get our best over the French, quite frankly. These things are doable, and they have narratives associated with them, which is what the historians unpack. So for me, that's what narrative says, is not the how of what happened, but the why question. And
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
My name's Mike Smith. My understanding is that economics began, when it began to be, before it became science, was political economy. And so what my question really is, what is the role of the relationships of power in understanding economics? And perhaps directly to you, Angus, you mentioned the intervention of the Prime Minister at the time in 2008, and I remember the same thing back in New Zealand, where I was at the time. So the political, what I took you to say from that was political intervention was crucial to management of a really serious crisis. And my question is then, would it perhaps be two things to say? Would it perhaps be worth adding to your panel on macroeconomics somebody with some experience in relations of power, as well as the sort of more scientific things? That's the first thing. The second thing is, would you say that the result of that intervention in 2008 has been a success for everybody around the world?
Angus.
So the point I was trying to make was that the government or the minister at the time, their recognition that the role of the state here was, what is the role of the state in any country, if we get to the nation? It's really to be the insurer of last resort. When everything else fails, you look after the citizens. If it's a war or whatever it is, or a famine, I don't know what it could be. And at that point, somebody had to break this fear that was going around the room and remind you that actually you're sitting in one horse car's road and you can actually change the rules if necessary. And it's that recognition that's easily forgotten. What are the roles of the various actors in an economy? That's my point. They're not the same. They're not all trying to mimic the private sector in the Green Book. They actually have fundamentally different roles. And for me, I remember feeling very proud of sitting next to the minister. I thought that person did a terrific job, anyway. Did a terrific job in actually making that clear at that time where things were looking extremely clear. So just to point out the differences. In terms of power, I completely accept your point. In economics, we tend to abstract from these notions. In fact, we disguise it, which is even much worse, because in our designing of models, we implicitly decide what to put in and what to leave out. But we don't tell you what's left out. We just say this is it. And so there's value judgments all over the place in making these models. They're just implicit, but nevertheless vitally important. And the question of did it lead to improvement around the rest of the world, I think that in the 2009 G20 meeting that Obama and Brown were at, where people committed to a coordinated fiscal policy to try and grow their way out of it. My personal view is that was a good thing. It seemed to stabilise everything. But what happens thereafter in terms of regulation, in terms of future policy, unfortunately those things change. One, the sadness was that, to a certain extent, with that sort of urgency, the creativity in terms of policy, once that urgency's gone, unfortunately seems to evaporate a little bit. And I'm reminded of the measures that FDR put through in the Depression. I mean, they make what we do these days look tiny. They were incredibly broad, and I would suggest they did actually have vision. And actually, many of them have lasted to today.
Josh?
Yeah, I'll just add to that support that entirely. I mean, just on the political economy, economics used to be called political economy. So, when Alan Smith, John Stuart Mill, Ricardo, and some extent Marx as well, were writing, they did view it as the topic as political economy, the relationship between the state and the market. And they did have a sense that the state could shape markets for the public good, public purpose, and again, that's what we're trying to recapture. It's quite interesting, you hear about Adam Smith talking about free markets, but if you actually read much of his work, he rails against excessive profits and rents and inequality, particularly in the land market, for example. And he says a truly free market is one that's free from those kinds of unearned forms of income and rents. And of course, a key area where you have these kind of rents is finance, and also land, obviously, today. High house prices, well, that money's going somewhere, it's going to the landowners. And for me, the great failure, 10 years on from the crisis, is in terms of policy, we haven't addressed this fundamental problem of value extraction and rent extraction. It's not even in the lexicon, it's not in the narratives of politicians. The narrative in the finance sector is almost purely around risk. We have de-risked the banking system by forcing them to hold more capital. That's not the question. The question is the banking system serving a public purpose? Is it allocating capital to productive sectors? Is it supporting innovation? Is it going to enable us to rebuild our economies and make them sustainable? That's not being talked about. What's being talked about, 10 years on is, the banks have got more capital. So I think that's a major problem.
Okay, thank you.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is Michael Johnson. I was a former engineer and then an Eagle investment banker for a long time. Three quick comments and a question. Angus, comment about government becoming risk-based, take of last resort. That does invite moral hazard. And we wicked investment bankers kind of grasped that at the time.
Yeah.
The second point to Josh, I'm involved in policy with a certain Prime Minister at the moment, and we are seriously thinking about a primary property gains tax to replace inheritance tax. Third point, very quickly for John, I'm going to go home this evening and see my wife, who is a former actuary and absolutely devoted to her models. What am I going to say to her? And the question for all of you is, I'm sort of becoming much more intrigued by our innate talent, I'm a baby boomer, to kick the fiscal can down the road, looking at the unfunded public promises that we've been making in respect to pensions, the decommissioning costs and so on. What do you, as economists, related, say to the government of the day, irrespective of its political view, that is going to slow down its innate talent to kick the can down the road on behalf of the UCL students who are in here?
Thank you. Since we got 3 questions in one layer, I'm going to give the panel a chance to remember. Well, go for it. There's only one more after that. The last one is gentleman over there who already has a microphone. So, Angus, was for you. Was it?
This is the moral hazard question. This is the sort of inevitable consequences. If you give people some help with flooding, are they not going to take more risks and not have the right damp-proof courses and so on in the houses? So you do have that issue. But the time to start worrying about the moral hazard is not when the narrative has changed to we have a very serious problem here. That's not the time to be worrying about the narrative. And the consequence of the moral hazard, of course, is that's where you have to use the role of regulation to make sure it's safety first, to get rid of that, to try and limit the moral hazard that you, I think, invariably create by having this inevitable backstop given the role of the government. But that's the role of regulation, and to try and minimise that very real risk that you brought down.
Josh was next.
I'm not sure your point was a question. It was, are you asking me whether I think a tax on primary residence is a good idea? Yes. It is a good idea. I would support a land value tax, an annual land value tax. Politically, it's quite a difficult sell, so I think we need to be quite clever about how you position it. Quite like a recent proposal by John Mulbauer to have a green land value tax, where you're taxed on both the total land you own, but also you wouldn't pay tax on the property if it was fuel efficient. Quite nice.
John.
The question you asked me could hardly be better set up if I'd written it myself. There is an article which Mervyn King and I wrote as precursor to the book we're writing together on radical uncertainty, which is specifically on the question of the relationship between actuarial modelling and the entrenchment of the baby boomers at the expense of the UCL students of today. And because it was prompted by the USS dispute, it was published last week in the Times Higher Education. I would refer you and everyone else in the audience who's interested to that. And if you don't have easy access to the Times Higher, you can find it on my website, which I also recommend.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And a last question before we break.
I wanted to try the fiscal one.
Okay, please do. Yeah, go ahead.
Governments are kicking the can down the road because they've been told, and they were told in 2010, Angus is wrong to suggest that the change just happened because the change happened. The change happened because governments, because economists, and in particular Kenneth Rogoff, had argued that if debt rises above 90% of GDP, the world will fall apart. Right? And so George Osborne took that advice and decided that he was going to aim to reduce debt to 90% of GDP. The fact of the matter is that governments cannot reduce the debt. Chancellors cannot reduce the debt, and they can certainly not do it by cutting spending and increasing taxes. The only way to reduce the debt, the public debt, is to create economic prosperity, to ensure that tax revenues are generated to balance the spending that the government has undertaken in the past. And that is the only way to do it. And Keynes explained that to us, and we've forgotten. Keynes explained to us that that's the only way to reduce the debt. We look at the issue of public debt just like looking through a telescope the wrong way around, expecting governments and politicians to cut spending and increase taxes and reduce the debt. And we've seen, because Mr. Osborne failed dismally in his ambition to reduce the debt to 70%, it's just systematically kept rising, and it's now at 90% of GDP and still rising, right? So until the economy gets fixed, there's no way to fix the debt.
Thank you very much. So.
Hi, I'm Harry Bowman. I've just started my final year of A-levels, and my question is, basically in the last few years, I think we've seen generally within the public a rise in a distrust of economic experts. You can see it with Trumpism and Brexit as well. And I would suggest that if there is a major distrust within the majority of the population of economic experts, then surely economics as a subject becomes, to some extent, void if there's no reason for, in the democracy that we live in, the population is going to vote with the advice of the economic experts. So my question generally is, do you believe that economics as a subject requires a sort of radical makeover, not only in the way that it's taught, but in what we teach and how it's presented?
Who's going to answer that one? John.
The largest single source of public mistrust of economists is that there are frequent so-called economic forecasts presented which do not materialise. One of the banes of my life is if you go to a dinner party and say you're an economist, people believe that what you do is prepare economic forecasts. And almost very few economists actually prepare economic forecasts, and even many of the ones who do don't take these forecasts seriously. The reason the forecasts are presented is because there is an insatiable public demand for forecasts. And until we find some way of reducing that demand, I'm afraid this nonsense will continue.
Can I step in there and just say that if you're thinking about becoming an economist or doing an economics degree, I would absolutely say yes, because what the whole discipline needs is revision. It's something which actually is tremendously exciting. It's in a state where there's an enormous amount known, and there's an enormous amount not known. And so, absolutely, if it's the kind of thing that really wakes you up in the morning and you think this is interesting, do it. Because you can need to be careful where you go and do it, but you'll work that out. It's certainly not something to write off as not a future. I just want to say something about narrative. It's very easy to think, particularly if we come from a more mathematical, positive science background, all of that stuff that narrative is about is, it's great, we love reading a story and it's all fluffy and there's no structural knowledge. No, that's not true. Narrative is a field in which there's absolutely cogent and good theory. And I commend one narrative theorist to you, who's Mary Laurie Ryan. And she has written a really interesting analysis of what is a tellable story. Now, it turns out that if you're telling a story to people, it's not just you communicating to them. They are engaged in the understanding of it. So the audience, the protagonists of the story, the author of the story, are all intimately related in the structure of how narratives are constructed. And the way it works is that as you say, you tell the first part of the story, the listener is conjuring up in their head what might happen. They're giving characterization to the protagonists. They're thinking about their possible motivations. They're predicting things about what will happen next. And a good story is one where actually it's not completely predictable. As new episodes appear, you learn new features, new facts, and you change your mind about motivations and so forth. And obviously, the crime drama always has to have a twist at the end, so all of your predictions come out wrong and somebody or other else did it. Because otherwise, it's not a tellable story. Now, in that, what stories are doing is they're using their power of working with the audience, with the listener, to recreate a whole series of social structures and social properties. They recreate ideas of good and bad, or ideas about the nature of society. And those are reproduced through the telling of the story and the participation of the audience in that. I think there's a lot to be said for thinking about the things we're talking about today, and thinking about how those kinds of structures and those arts practices actually can come together with the mathematics and the science practices to create a form of economics in which you've got both sides of engagement with the public in the nature of the narrative. And if we could do that, actually the Brexit problem would disappear. That nature of we don't believe what's happening and we don't believe the experts, it's because the experts have sequestered themselves into this corner that says we only do the positive, predictive, scientific modelling, and that's shown not to be adequate. So that would be my summing up. I'm going to pass on to Henry Lucen-Gore, who is the... Well, you can describe what you are, Henry, and say a few words about it. Thank you very much for organising this event this evening.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking our panel, who've done a great job tackling an incredibly complex and challenging problem, and Alan for ably chairing it and keeping us roughly to time. I think we're a bit late, Alan, 10 minutes.
I'm sorry.
But I hope you've really enjoyed it. My name is Henry Lucen-Gore, and I set up Promoting Economic Pluralism, and Anne's also involved in it as a trustee, and we have other very good trustees. We're a charity. We are about trying to create spaces for the sort of debates we've had here between different perspectives, because we believe passionately that in order to innovate, we need different perspectives, we need different views, and in the past there's been too much groupthink, basically, too much narrow crowd behaviour, really, with everyone sort of getting into a particular place, which has got us into trouble. And we see this in teaching, and we see it in research and so on. So we're trying to make space, and one of the things we're doing is actually an international accreditation scheme for master's courses around the world, because there is innovation, there is good thinking going on, to raise them up and highlight them where you can do pluralist economics, where you can see different perspectives. So any students here, there will be information. So I suppose the bad news is that we really haven't solved all the problems this evening. The good news is that you actually have lots more opportunities to address and engage and take this debate forward, and we're going to make that happen. For a start, please do collect a complimentary copy of our magazine, The Mint, which this is the 7th issue, the first issue that we've actually printed, and do consider subscribing to it. The website has further events and information we'll tell you about. Please also, we are a charity, this is where the cry for help comes, and do help us. We've got a bucket as you go out. Sorry?
A bucket collection.
A bucket collection on the way out to keep us going, because this is a huge challenge, because the forces of conformity and defence to keep to the place that a lot of people are comfortable in are very strong. So we need all the help we can get from you. Thank you very much.